Well, hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to the very first Insta Live session of Kitaabi Baatein. I'm Abhishek, also known as Books Wale Bhaiya. In this first episode, I'm having a conversation with a very well-known author who is famous for his horror genre. He's K. Hari Kumar, and he is joining us soon for the live session. Hi, Hari. Good evening.
Good evening, good evening. How are you? What's happening?
I'm good, Hari. Welcome to Kitaabi Baatein. And it's now, while the COVID restrictions have been lifted, the heat of Delhi still does not allow to have a live session offline. And so I thought it's always better to meet online through Insta. So where are you based currently?
Yeah, I'm based out of Pune.
Then the weather is definitely better there. It's not like Delhi, I guess.
No, I don't know. See, once you are here, you're used to good weather, and suddenly the
Right.
heat will start setting in. Even at 35 degrees Celsius looks too much too much to take on.
35. Oh,
35,
it's
36, whatever it
comfortable.
is. It still feels
It's,
hot. But of course,
yeah,
I
yeah,
can
but
understand where you're coming from. It's 45, 44. So
yeah,
I've
it's
been
warm.
there. I've been there, so I know how exactly it feels. But once you're there, once you are, used to that 40, 45 degrees ka condition,
Right.
I don't think you'll feel that heat wave.
Yeah, of course, of course. So 35 is very good for a Delhiite. If you ask, I would say, man, why can't we be there when it's 45 is the norm? All
Yeah.
right. So thank you, everyone who has joined. My guest today is K. Hari Kumar. While he needs no introduction to a book reader, but I'll still introduce for the benefit of those who have joined. So Hari Kumar, now famously known as Horror Kumar, is a novelist and screenwriter. He's born in Kochi, Kerala, and he did his schooling from Gurgaon. He has been writing since almost a decade now. His first book, When Strangers Meet, was published in 2013, which is 9 years ago. Today, over a decade, he has authored about 7 books and 3 screenplays. And one of his books, The Other Side of Her, is also adapted into a web series called Drum, starring Kalki Kochli. The most interesting fact about Hari is that he is the first Indian writer who was listed on Amazon.com's global bestseller list in the horror category. So this is a brief introduction about Hari. And so Hari, to start with, we all know you as the horror writer, and I have today in front of me 2 of your most famous books, India's Most Haunted and Dakma. And before we start, I have to tell you about India's Most Haunted. So this is Hari's first book, which I read. This is not his first book, and this started my interest in horror writing. And I read Hari's other books after reading this. And as much as I praise this book, I recommend this book. One caveat: it's not for the weak-hearted, because some of the stories are like which will scare the living daylights out of you. And I distinctly remember 1 or 2 of the stories, man, I could not sleep well that night, thinking about that mall, the guard coming, and I don't know, it's tough, but an extremely well written book. And I must say, I must congratulate. This is my favorite book of all the books Hari has written, and I think I've read now almost all the books. So Hari, to start with, people know you as the best-selling horror supernatural writer. What about Hari as a person? So if you can tell us a bit about maybe your childhood or your early years, and how that shaped up you into becoming a writer.
Hari as a person is a very simple, down to earth, no nonsense person. I think that's pretty much it. I like you mentioned earlier, I was born in Kerala to a south to a to a family that had already migrated from Karnataka. So we're not really exactly Malayalis, but yeah.
Okay.
So, but yeah, if somebody asks me where I am from, I tell them I'm from Kerala because that's the first language that I learned. So
Right.
Malayalam is my mother tongue, so that's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
But then my parents they migrated to Haryana,
Okay.
Faridabad. From
Yeah.
there, it was Gurgaon, and then I was there for the next 15 years of my life. So that is from 1996 to 2011, which pretty
Oh,
much
okay.
makes me Gurgaon uh,
Right.
boy, because that's where my entire schooling happened. My education, my college, my engineering, everything happened there. So if somebody asks me where are you from exactly, I don't have an answer.
Right.
So
Right.
because I have this mix of all cultures. So I think that is what makes me that exposed me to different kinds of folklores, different kinds of dadima, nanima stories, right from the stories that my grandmother used to tell me,
Right.
from Kerala, to the stories that my landlady used to tell me in
Oh, okay.
Faridabad. Those were from Punjab and from
Oh,
Peshawar, from her, from where she had migrated from. So this kind of exposed me to a lot of, and my friends were mostly Bengalis, so they wrote the stories from that side, that part of the world. So
right.
overall, all these stories, and then there were these magazines, Chanda Mama.
Chanda Mama.
Yeah, Chanda Mama was, I think, the most. Uh, I mean, the most missed thing in my life. The thing that I miss the most right now is Chanda Mama. Because,
I completely agree. Yes.
yeah, because that's where I got all these visuals of Vikram Vetal and all those
Correct. Correct.
scary things. So I think those things shaped my journey as a writer. And of course,
Right.
there were all these early cartoons of Scooby Doo.
Scooby-Doo.
I think that's when I was growing up. Those cartoons were available on Cartoon Network was introduced in India.
Cartoon
So
Network was, yes.
yeah, so that's how all those things kind of shaped me up. And then there were the horror movies and the books. But before all those things, I think it's this multicultural environment where I was brought up,
Right.
which I was exposed, at a very young age. I think that's what made me a horror writer.
And so, other than these folk tales, Chanda Mama and other magazine stories from even your landlady, what other kind of books or authors you liked in, say, in school or college time? Any specific kind of books or specific authors you read and you liked reading them?
So when I was in school, I used to read a lot of Charles Dickens. Christmas Carol was there in the syllabus, so that's where you pick up these writers. So Charles Dickens came from there, and then Roald Dahl stories.
Yeah.
Then there were the stories from these magazines like Chanda Mama, because I used to read Chanda Mama until I was like 15 or something, and then it was stopped totally.
It was stopped, yes.
Yeah. So then all these stories, I mean, I think Roald Dahl stories, and there was this short story by E.V. Lucas.
Yes, yes.
I always forget the name. I mean, The Face on the Wall. Sorry, say Face on the Wall.
Right.
I think that story kind of pushed me into writing because I never thought of myself being a writer. Until I read that story. Because only after reading that story, I started realizing, this is a very interesting story. I should also try writing. And then I used to look at all these, when you go to these bookshops or, you see these spines of these books and you see a writer's name, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and all those things, you started feeling कि यार करना है किसी ना एक दिन, I also want to fascinate someone. कोई बच्चा देखेगा कि हाँ के हरे कुमार उठाना है वो book. Somewhere उसी time वो एक fascination आया. And then I started writing. Then eventually, as I was growing up, my taste also changed. I was moving towards movies. I was watching Tim Burton's movies. So, वो जो visual imagery है वो वहाँ से आता है. So whatever I write. So for example, That Frequent Visitor, which is my second book.
Yes.
The whole time I was visualizing imagery that was there in Tim Burton's movies. Dark Shadow, Edward Scissorhands, Batman even, the one that he had directed. So he gets his inspiration from other stuff. So I think then again it was Stephen King. I was moving on to Stephen King. Then Ira Levin. Ira Levin was, I think that was Rosemary's Baby. That was the book which kind of completely pushed me into horror. Because after watching the movie and then reading the book, Rosemary's Baby, there was just one thing in my mind. This is how a story should be told. This is how. Absolutely. I mean, it's a Bible in itself.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Humor. I mean, humor, not the ha 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 wala humor, but very pointed, piercing humor about the society that we live in. Right. About religion, about faith, about the beliefs, and how certain things, certain ideologies shape your belief systems.
Belief system.
And we are not even aware of that. वो सब उस book में है, वो सब उस movie में है. So I think that's the one defining point after which I really wanted to take up horror very seriously. And this was after I wrote the third book.
Yeah, your first book was Where Strangers Meet was about father and son relation and societal trends and all that. So completely a non-horror, a general fiction, we can say.
It has a horror element. I won't reveal that because that's a twist in the end.
Yeah.
But that book was more autobiographical because at
Yes.
that time I was just 21 when I was writing it.
Okay.
And some wise guy said, imitation precedes creation. So I was just imitating what was happening in my life.
Right.
So whatever happened in my life, I didn't want to do engineering, and I always had a very bad time. Back in my final year, I was down with illness, and there were a lot of things going on at my home also. My parents were having a very difficult time with each other. So all those things were kind of putting a lot of stress and pressure on me and my family as well.
Right.
So this time I felt so critically ill that I couldn't go to college for a whole semester, and there was like a lot of uncertainty in my life. And then I asked myself, what do I want to do? I mean, if I don't live tomorrow, then what do I have to do? So I told myself, see, I always wanted to be a writer. Let me write. And then what did I? मुझे लिखना क्या है वो समझ में नहीं आ रहा because I used to begin writing before that. Right from class 12 वो था कि लिखना है, शुरू करता था, बीच में बंद हो जाता था क्योंकि डिटर्मिनेशन नहीं था, कोई फैक्टर नहीं था पुश करने के लिए. But then when this happened, when there was this uncertainty looming in front of me, and there was this idea that was coming into my head कि अगर मैंने engineering नहीं किया होता और मैं घर से भाग गया होता तो क्या होता. So that was the inspiration for When Strangers Meet. So I rewinded everything. I was bedridden. I was rewinding everything कि 4 साल पहले क्या क्या हुआ 12th के बाद. And if this young guy called Jay, which was me basically, if he had run away instead of actually falling into the trap of the whole engineering gamble that was going on at that time, तो क्या होता. So that's how that story happened. And because of that illness and because of the uncertainty, I had this motivation कि ये खत्म करना है. I didn't stop. I finished it. It took me 6 months to write, and I overcame that illness as well. Took a long time, but then still, I think this writing was like I think it was cathartic to some extent, and then it took another 2 years to get it published. Once you finish writing, that's the time when you realize, oh, okay, this was very easy. Right. The next step is the actual, the bigger hindrance. So it took 2 years for the book to get published.
So that was actually going to be my second question. So as when you started, of course, it was a first book, and you did not, you can say, have a track record of of writing, and did not have a pedigree to speak of. So what challenges you faced in getting a book published through a regular or a reputed publisher? You can just speak a bit on that.
So you see, there are a couple of things. One is if you are a celebrity or if you are a subject matter expert and you are writing a book on that subject, then you definitely already have a push and you will have good publishers to because you are writing good stuff. Okay, but when you're coming from a very simple, normal, middle class background, whether or not you write good stuff, you still have a big challenge ahead of you.
Yes.
Right, and coming from a middle class background, I know exactly the kind of opposition that you are thrown at from the people around you. यार ये सब नहीं करना है. Writing is not a profession. It can be a passion, it can be a vocation, but it's not a profession.
Not a profession.
And
true.
There are not many people who can actually advise you how to proceed. So for me, it was all learning by myself. When I started out, finished the book, engineering khatam ho gaya tha. I had my parents had come back to Kerala, so I was far away from Delhi because that was where the whole publishing circle is.
True.
So I would come back to Delhi and I would pitch all these stories of mine. And my dream was to get published with the big five, the Penguin, the HarperCollins,
Penguin,
yeah. So my dream was to get published with HarperCollins, to be honest, and because one of my favorite books, The Alchemist, was published by HarperCollins.
Okay.
And in the forward, Paulo Coelho has written about it. When he received a call from HarperCollins, he was elated. So I had always dreamt that HarperCollins publish karega karke. But then eventually all the big five, they rejected it, and then Rupa had shown some interest, but then eventually the manuscript they didn't proceed with it. And finally there was Srishti. Srishti again, I was very doubtful because they were publishing all those love stories.
Yeah, yeah.
The kind of love
Right.
stories Ravinder Singh and Durjoy Datta and Preeti Shinani, this type.
Hmm.
And I was not a romance writer, and this
Right.
was a father-son story. About this was about three men. All of them had some kind of a problem with their father or a son.
Valuation.
Right. So I was very doubtful कि ये होगा कि नहीं होगा, but luckily for me, Srishti took it up, and I think it took me. The book was book. I finished the book in 2010, November,
Mm-hmm.
and I signed the contract in November 2012.
Well, that's 2 years.
That's 2 years, and it was released in May 2013. So that's
13.
almost 2.5 years of waiting. And finally, the book came out, and again, then the challenge was getting noticed.
I didn't know this. That's true.
Because by that time, Amazon had introduced Kindle.
Yeah.
अभी जितना है उतना नहीं था, but उस time,
Mhm.
everybody was jumping onto the bandwagon, and the blogs were getting, really popular. Luckily,
Right.
there were no reels, thankfully, and so there was a lot of competition that way also. There was self-publishing, वो boom हो रहा था. There were some publishers who were kind of bringing self-publishing to India.
Yeah.
So the challenge was to get noticed,
Yes.
and I think luckily for me that story was very. When Singh meet the story, every youngster could connect with that story.
Absolutely.
Because it was a story of a youngster.
Yes.
So probably that's how that book succeeded, and it sold very well. And after 2 years, I wrote the second book, which was a proper horror book, which
Yeah.
was That Frequent Visitor. But by that time, I knew the kind of struggles you have, while writing, and then what happens next, the publishing, wala. But I was very much set because I knew the publisher. At least I knew one publisher
Right.
who would be, whom I could send my manuscript to. So that happened, and eventually I was picked up by HarperCollins, which was a dream come true for me in 2018.
18. Right. And so India's Most Haunted, and it was published on HarperCollins, and then Dakwa as well. It's on HarperCollins.
So the
So
next two are also by HarperCollins. So
oh,
yeah,
that's great.
you're
So
hearing it first on your live session.
oh, that's great. So coming to your book, so you like now kind of specialize in horror. You can say as your name is more like Horror Kumar now, not Hari Kumar. How you see we have seen an emergence of Indian writing in English since past 15 years or so. You can say ever since Chetan Bhagat started writing, and people started taking more interest in English writing, and then many more authors came in, and now we are seeing from general fiction, they have moved to more specialized fiction, like you write horror. There are people who write thrillers. There are people, a lot of mythological writers. So how do you see this Indian writing in English going ahead, say in the next 5, 10 years? Do you see any specific genres to be more popular, or do you see even more new writers joining in, given that there's huge demand for Indian writers now?
See, right now, I think this is one of the worst time to be a new writer. All over the world. It's not just in India. It's all over the
Right.
world. Still, because of the pandemic scene, everything kind of changed.
Yes.
Yeah? So, and there are more people who are, with self-publishing. More books are there on the bookshelves these days, and with traditional bookstores closing, you've got Amazon, which has disrupted everything.
Yes.
And although democratization of literature is not a bad thing, because it's giving opportunity to a lot of good
Yes.
people who would have otherwise been unseen.
Unseen.
They
Yes.
would have went unseen. But it is also opening the market for people for very bad literature as well. Now
Yeah.
you have to take it with a pinch of salt.
No, that's definitely true. I mean, everyone is thinking of becoming a writer, and
Exactly.
even
So the profession, so the thin line between a professional writer and a vocational or a passionate writer or someone who's doing it for a time pass,
yes,
वो कहीं पे blur हो रहा है, which is
blur
not
हो
a
रहा है.
good thing because there are writers like me who spend 2 years in researching a particular subject and then coming out with a novel.
with a novel.
That's what a professional writer does. Even if it's a screenplay, we do a lot of research into what should go and what should not be on the screen and everything. So that way, I think we have to identify the good books here,
Yes.
the quality, better quality books, and then as for genres, I think See, horror ऐसा नहीं है कि I started writing horror. It was there. वो
Yes.
शुरू से ही है actually.
Right.
Our folklores are full of all those mythical creatures and all
Correct.
those things. Regional languages में horror.
Till now, horror was more associated with movies, you can say. Till you can say 10 years back, we had this Ramsey Brothers movies, and then we have the Z horror show and all. So whenever anyone talked of horror, they more linked it to the movies, and it was less in the literary circles.
No. I wouldn't agree with you there because see again, literature में आपको pulp horror fiction मिलता था. हिंदी में है, मराठी में है, मलयालम में है. As early as I think in the 70s, Malayatur has written Yakshi, which is a psychological horror fiction of the literary kind, not even pulpy kind of horror fiction. So it's not like नहीं था. ये है कि अभी Indian English में, I'm talking about Indian English, there's a sudden boom. I think first it was Chetan Bhagat who disrupted the market with the normal middle class life ki story.
Yes.
That was a huge hit. And then it was the campus love stories. Then came the time of your mythological fiction, brought by Amish and Anand Nimkantan. And then uske baad, it was, I think, mythological fiction ruled for a long time.
Yes.
And right now, it was, I think, until the pandemic, it was non-fiction which was ruling the charts. If you ask any bookseller, it was non-fiction which was ruling the charts. And suddenly, horror non-fiction, that is true accounts of haunted places, suddenly there was a demand for all that. But again, now I think we are back to fiction, psychological thrillers. Horror, maybe psychological horror works more. And I happen to write psychological horror, which is more rooted on reality rather than in some supernatural entity.
Some supernatural.
क्योंकि at the end of the day, when a reader आज के डेट पे कोई मूवी भी देखने जाता है, वो बंदा भूत प्रेत को देख के हंसता है, यार ये तो हो नहीं सकता. Right, 3 is an exception because it had a very beautiful symbolism involved. But उसके बाद जो मूवी बनाई उसको देख के लोग हंस रहे थे क्योंकि वो हॉरर नहीं कॉमेडी था.
Comedy. That's true.
There's a difference between a bulbul and a bomb. I won't name the film, but you know which bomb it is.
Right.
So movies like Bulbul, stories like Bulbul, they are very much in demand because there's a set of writers, a very niche set of writers, because we horror writers, we don't cater to masses. We don't cater to masses. So our advances are also very less compared to, say, a romance writer or a mythological fiction writer. But then, the readers who read horror are very loyal and they know what they want to read and they know horror from different parts of the world. It's not just Indian horror that they read. They read horror from all of the world. So that's the kind of audience that you're catering to. So the publishers also know कि कौन सा genre work करता है, कितना readership है, based on the sales figures that they get. It's not plotted. I mean, a writer can go around and say कि I'm a bestseller, I have sold this many copies, but the publishers have the actual numbers.
Yeah.
Right. So they know what is the trend in the market, what are readers leaning to. चाहे वो Amazon से खरीदें या book store से खरीदें, वो क्या खरीद रहे हैं. So उसके basis पे they take up कि किस type की book publish होनी चाहिए.
And as you talked about the research, so I'm sure in writing India's most haunted, a lot of research must have gone through. So how did that idea of writing about places which are associated with horror, and that too you must have searched of 50 odd places, there are 50 stories in India's most haunted. So how did that idea came along, and how many of places have you actually visited out of the places you talked about in the book?
India's most haunted, I was writing Brahm at that time. ब्रह्म के pitching sessions चल रहे थे, so back and forth चल रहा था उस time, and I got this email from my editor at HarperCollins, and I was asked if I'd be interested to write this kind of a compilation.
All right.
Like origin stories kind of things about haunted places in India. So like I said, it was my dream to get published with HarperCollins, and this was an offer that I received from their side. So I immediately loved the idea because that is something, it's not exactly a travel journal, but it is like you're going to these places. And I had visited a few of them earlier, and like I mentioned before, मैंने बहुत travel किया life में, and even for films you have to travel to all these
Yes.
locations.
Yes, of course.
And the films that I've written, they're all horror, so वो भी एक factor है. So I immediately loved the idea, and I told that I would like to take this up. And so that's how the offer came, and then it was about finding these 50 places.
Yeah.
कुछ ऐसी जगह जो सबने सुन रखी हो, कुछ ऐसी जगह जो लोगों को नहीं पता हो, कुछ रीजनल, जैसे कि आई टोल्ड यू कि बचपन में मेरी दादी नानी की कहानियां वो सब साउथ की है, जो मेरी लैंडलेडी थी वो पंजाब की थी, तो वो वहाँ उस साइड की कहानी, नॉर्थ की कहानियां सुनी, मेरे क्लासमेट्स. सो ये सारी कहानियां जो भी मैंने बचपन में जो व्हाटएवर स्टोरीज आई हैड feasted upon, I went back to those stories. And then I started lining up this, listing these places. कि ये जगह हैं, भानगढ़ हो गया, कुलधारा हो गया, कुलभात हो गया, then दिल्ली में संजय वन, केरला में ये वन. Yeah, so this is how I made a list, and Sanjay Van वगैरह तो I have visited when I was in Delhi. I visited those places, and there were places which I wanted to visit. So there are places जहाँ पे मेरी wife का घर है कर्नाटका में. तो so it's after India's war, so I made sure that I visited her place. इसी बहाने चलते रहे, मायके चलते हैं, लेके गए, और वहाँ पे मेरा purpose कुछ और था. So I visited all those haunted places there in Karnataka, nearby places, and then ब्रह्म के shooting के time पे हिमाचल के जो haunted places थे वो visit किया. Then back in Bombay, when I came back to Bombay, I visited all the haunted places in Bombay. So then everything was clear. I was very much, the pictures were very clear कि ये जगह ऐसे दिखते हैं. And this is the, this is the visual sense of that place, and then I started writing those stories. And obviously horror है, भूत प्रेत की कोई सच्ची कहानी तो कोई कुछ कहता नहीं है. अगर कोई कहता है कि मैंने भूत देखा है, तो my first reaction would be कि डॉक्टर से मिलने. डॉक्टर से. See, that's the thing. So writing those stories, no matter how I write, if I write कि हाँ वहाँ पे भूत है, कुलधारा में भूत है, ये है, वो है, it looks like I am promoting a belief which is not real.
Right.
So then मैं उसे उलझन में पड़ गया था, and then I spoke to my editor and I said, see, I don't think I can write it like a true account because I'm not a paranormal investigator.
Right.
Even if I am, I can't claim कि this exists because there is no proof, right? So I don't want to spread supernatural or superstition among people, among readers, by claiming that these are true incidents or true hauntings. So that's how this idea came. कि इसको story के form में लिखते हैं. Right. It happened to some other person, some fictitious person who visited that place. Right. So then India's Most Haunted के stories बने, वो 50 stories वहाँ से आते हैं. So it's all based on true rumors, newspaper reports. उसका एक dramatization है.
And I think one of the things I liked most in your book was that I would say it was you can say horror for everyone, because whenever we associate horror, we associate it with graveyard or some old havelis or forts. And you talked about horror even in some parking lot in Gurgaon or in a shopping mall. And I, whenever after that visited a mall and I press the lift button, I always remembered your story. When यहाँ से कोई guard आगे गए, sir मैं आपको लेकर जाता हूँ. So that is the thing I like, people can relate themselves to this horror, because whenever we talked of horror, we either talked of a night or some haunted place, like as I said in Ramsey Brothers movies, there will be a haveli where no one will go. Only that person will go acting in the movie, and then he will experience something supernatural. So this is one way. That's what the originality I like most in the book, that this is something for everyone, from a shopping mall to a Gurgaon parking, and of course with your own Bhangarh and all, which are known for being haunted.
Notoriously
So
known.
that was really, I would say, interesting. And so in your book, in Dakma, as you talked about Dakma, the Towers of Silence, and we had one story also in India's Most Haunted on the Towers of Silence, Perizad's story. So anything in particular you liked about the idea of Tower of Silence, or you had anything you experienced in Mumbai that you thought of, after writing a story, writing a full-fledged novel on this subject?
Yeah, so you've read India's Most Haunted very carefully. So I'll tell you what exactly happened. I was there in Bombay for a meeting. Brahm ke baad, there was another series that I was working on which didn't take off, unfortunately. But I was at this actress's house. She was the one who was producing it. So उनके घर के पास था बैंड्रा में. So उनसे मिलने के बाद I was living in Chennai at that time.
Okay.
So after the whole meeting, the पूरा discussion वगैरह हो गया. We agreed on most of the things, and then I was coming out. I had some time. Okay. So India's Most Wanted तब खत्म नहीं हुआ था मेरा. I had to write 2 more stories, and then बैंड्रा में था. Then I thought कि ठीक है थोड़ा घूम लेता हूँ. Maybe I'll visit a couple of more haunted places which I had missed in the previous trip. So that's how Bandra से Malabar Hill में there was this apartment complex, and उसके ठीक सामने दाखमा है.
Okay.
So the moment I went to the apartment complex, obviously I couldn't enter or anything, but my was visual. I don't want to go inside or anything. I just want to take an outside का visual like feel लेना था मुझे, so that I could write how I felt. So उसके बाद I took that path which leads to the Dharma, and obviously अंदर तो जाना allowed नहीं था, and I didn't have anyone with me who could accompany or anything. And it's a religious space. You have to maintain you have to respect the religious rules.
Yes.
So I was there. I was standing outside the Dharma, and I had this very weird, earthy kind of a feeling, which kind of was giving me goosebumps.
Okay.
And suddenly I was getting these weird stories in my head, and immediately I went back and I jotted down everything. And then while writing India's Most Wanted, I wrote this story about a woman who was living in a house near the Dharma.
Near the Dharma, yeah.
That was just a very simple story.
Yeah.
Okay. But then after that manuscript went to the editor and all those things were happening, and then we had a book deal where Dharma was optioned to a production house. So this time I was still I don't know why, because certain times there's a plan A and there's a plan B. Plan A will be some story, plan B will be for some other story, and suddenly these two combine together.
Okay.
So I had this character called Anahita Anand.
Yeah.
He was in my head, and I had created that character for a web series that never got made. Okay.
Okay.
But the character was still in my head, and then there was a story in India's Most Wanted where there was this character called Selina.
Okay.
Right, who was living in his apartment near the restaurant. And the whole idea of a woman who is meant, because that's what many housewives go through, when husbands ignore them, educated women who don't, who are not allowed to, go to work or whatever, and then they are isolated, exposed to isolation at home. They go through a lot of mental trauma, which they never talk about, because they think it's normal to go through all those things, right? So that was the idea of Anahita Anand for me, because I've seen some people who are very close to me who have undergone those traumatic experiences, and then there's this extreme case where she has had a brain injury, a traumatic brain injury, a TBI.
Okay.
When the contract was being signed for the film deal, I told told the person who was representing me, I told him, please, I don't want to give that story. Hold that story. You can give all the 49 other stories. I want that story because I'm working on something else. That's how उस story को रोक के बाकी 49 stories के rights दे दिए, and then इस story को I started working, and I pitched the idea to HarperCollins also कि ये idea है, this is what I'm working on, and I would like to work this, and the proposal was accepted, and eventually I started writing, and it was supposed to come out in October 2021, but फिर COVID हो गया, COVID की वजह से पूरा market बंद.
Yes.
And then I got 1 more year to rewrite the entire manuscript at least 4 or 5 times. Revise and rewrite, and until I was totally satisfied with what was there. So what you see right now is a result of a story that I wrote for India's Most Wanted, along with the character that I wrote for a web series, and a lot of revisions.
Right. And so, as you are now who has written both novels and short stories. So, in terms of what people prefer to read, do you see the people typically prefer to read more of novels rather than short stories. I mean, your book, of course, is very famous, the short stories book. But in terms of the, you can say the readers' demand, what do you see is more works more in the market? If we say that it's novels or short stories, and how do you see the future of especially short story writing? Is novels are there are in plenty. How do you see the future of short story writing, especially in India?
See, short stories का I always feel कि short stories work as anthologies, but most of my readers from the first book, they love what I read, what I write as a novel.
As a novel, right?
Right. I think that's what I have. That's the feedback that I've received. जो जिन लोगों को other side of her या when strangers meet या frequent visitor पसंद आया था, उन लोगों को they were expecting longer stories in India's Most Haunted.
Right.
So those who are used to those kind of writing, the entire first, second, third act wala structure, they would love novels.
Right.
But those who are used to reading short stories, who are maybe short on time or maybe because they enjoy that kind of writing, they'll read short stories. But overall, I think short stories ka, I mean, published भी कम होता है.
Yes.
At least horror genre में, not in the other this thing. But overall horror में बहुत कम है. If you even actually horror में books ही बहुत कम publish होते हैं.
बहुत कम होती है. No, that's true. That's true.
I'm sorry, what?
No, I'm saying that's true. In horror, the number of books are typically less. You're right there.
Yeah. So that's the thing. But now I think with these bigger publishers, publishing horror, at least during the October, November season, Halloween, Diwali, I think it's a good thing. It's a good sign because there are readers. There are readers who dig horror. So yeah, and besides, it's not just horror. So see, this is what I'm talking about. I mean, there are a lot of readers who have read Dharma and who were reluctant to pick it up because they thought it's a horror. Because it's a horror book. लेकिन पढ़ने के बाद, there were a lot of people who said, "Oh, this is not exactly the horror that we thought it would be, but this was more realistic. It was about a woman's journey." And that's exactly how I'm writing. I'm writing it as that character's journey. Dharma is that woman's journey from isolation at home to the redemption in the end.
In the end, yeah.
It's not India's Most Haunted. On the other hand, it's very simple stories. It's about ghosts and all those things. But Dharma, there's a larger message that I'm trying to give out. The next book that I'm writing, which I have not announced till now, but it's also with the same publisher and will be hitting the shelves in 2023. But that book again, it's a journey of a woman, of two women actually. One who's in the city, one who's in the rural part. So I think it's about those characters' journeys. It's not about the supernatural entities or anything, and that's what makes horror very special.
Yes.
And I think if you need an example from a film, Bulbul, Pari, these two are very typical examples of the kind of narrative structure that I'm following.
Right. Okay. So whatever you have written so far, which is your favorite book out of what all you have written so far? Which one you like the most?
See, writing is it's an evolution. It's a process in which the writer also evolves. So for me, my first one, the first crush, the first love, it's When Strangers Meet, because it's a simplest and the easiest thing that I've written because it was my life, and I know the mistakes that I've done in that book. And with every book, I've tried to overcome that. And if you ask me which is the most perfect book that I've written till now, I would say Dharma, because that's the most refined writing that I've done. But if you ask me which will be the next best, it will be the next one, because there will be more refining in that one. So I think that's how it is. But yeah, the first one is always nostalgic. You are always, very वो होता है. I think होता है और horror books में भी.
All right. So I have one last question before we open it for the audience. We have a 5-minute more with the audience. They can ask question after the last question. So Hari, what advice you as a writer would like to give to the future prospective writers?
Take it seriously, because most of the budding writers that I have met, they're all not very serious about writing. They're all, it's like, it's a passion, it's a hobby.
Okay.
If you're looking at it like that, then write a blog. Don't
Right.
become a writer and, unwanted competition. Mat do. But if you're serious about writing, you want to bring some kind of a change in society, then please pick up your laptops and type. I'm not saying pen, because these days nobody writes with a pen, at least I don't. So that's what I would say. If you're very serious about writing, make sure that you've got good knowledge about what you're writing. If it's fiction, see, again, writing can be of very different types. It could be fiction, it could be non-fiction. So my next two books, one of them is fiction, the other one is non-fiction. And in fact, the one that will be coming out next year, the idea for it was born with because I was researching on this non-fiction title that I'm writing.
Okay.
Which was supposed to come out next year. Now that is pushed to 2024, and this book has come usse pehle.
Okay.
So while researching for that particular book, I had read some news articles which gave me the idea for this particular fiction book.
Fiction.
So you have to make sure what kind of writing you want, and it might not be like what you are planning that's going to happen. I never thought I would be writing non-fiction, but I have written 2 non-fiction now. I mean, India's Most Wanted, I don't count it as non-fiction. But other than that, I've written 2 more non-fiction, which will be coming out in the next 3-4 years.
Right.
So eventually it's that. So the advice that I would give is be serious about what you want to write and what you want to do with your writing.
Right.
And once you're done that, write. That's the most important thing you can do, because if you don't write, you can never be a writer.
Of course.
Write, and after writing, if you want to get published, please give it to an editor first. That's very important. Something nobody told me when I started out.
Okay.
If somebody had given me that advice, I'd have definitely done that.
So I mean, before reaching out to a publisher, you got to get it edited quite well. That's what your message is.
See, if you are a first-time writer, so with big publishers, they have in-house editors who will go through the entire stuff and they'll give feedback to you, and it's a very huge process in itself. So with Darkma, with India's Most Wanted, I had like itna sara wo feedback aata hai. Then you take the good ones and you make the changes accordingly. But when you are a first-time writer and you are approaching a big publisher or a big agent, right? You have to make sure that your manuscript is of that quality. You may be a good speaker of the language, you may have read all the classics, you may have had a blog which is really awesome, but get it checked by an editor before submitting, so that at least they can give you a feedback, which will definitely help you. As a young writer at 23, I wasn't open to feedbacks. But now I know, I've learned from my mistakes that I should have been open to feedbacks at that time. But now it's a different thing. I'm always open to feedback. So I think that's what young writers, aspiring first-time writers, should be willing to do from their side. Because that time somebody comes and tells you कि ये ऐसे नहीं होता, ऐसे होता है. Many people get offended, and these days people get offended very easily. So it's very important to keep an open mind. Get an editor. Once you finish your manuscript, give it to an editor, and it should not be your English teacher.
Right.
It should be a professional editor, even if you have to pay that person, pay, because at the end of the day, that's their work, and they should be compensated for that. And then give it to a publisher after making all the changes that are required,
right? Or
an agent, whichever. And in fact, these days even agents also recommend sending manuscripts to editors for copywriting or whatever it is.
Yes.
So that's a very important thing which young writers don't know, and they should be doing it. Because otherwise you can always self-publish your manuscript on Kindle. But I honestly feel that it's not the right way to go. It's always better to go through an editor, because you might get certain feedbacks which you can use, which there must be some aspects which you miss because of some reason.
Of course. Thanks. That was really, I think, a useful piece of advice. So we now open it to the audience. Any questions you have, please write it in the comment box, and the next 5 to 7 minutes we will spend on answering. Hari will answer any of the questions you have. So I guess, do we have one question from Kanika. So which is your favorite horror movie, Hollywood or Bollywood?
Rosemary's Baby, The Shining, Bulbul. There was this movie called Manichitra Tare, which was remade as Bhul Bhulaiya in Hindi.
Okay.
There are plenty of horror movies that I love. There are recent movies like Relic, Hansel and Gretel, Exorcist. I love horror movies. I mean, कैसी भी हो मैं देख लेता हूँ. मुझे कोई I mean, कुछ हैं जो आजकल आ रही हैं जो कि देखने का मन भी नहीं करता, ट्रेलर देख के बंद करने का मन करता है, क्योंकि वो हॉरर नहीं, हॉरर का मजाक होता है. So, but still, I mean, sometimes even I watch those films. I think Ruby was a film that I watched, which I would never have watched, but I watched it. वो अलग बात है. So I think, I watch all kinds of horror movies. I love that feeling, you know, whether it's psychological horror or gothic horror.
Right.
Or even, sci-fi horror.
All right. Okay, so we have one question from Nirmal Bankar, and the question is why, as you talked about presenting your manuscript to an editor, so the question is why not to an English teacher? Because it's the language that needs to be checked, not the content. So, your take on this, Hari?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. What was the question?
So I remember when I said you said that get your your manuscript checked through an editor, a professional editor, and not your school teacher, English teacher, you said. So the question is why not to English teacher? It's the language, after all, that needs to be checked, not the content. So what's your take on this?
No. That's the problem. That's what a novice person or a person who hasn't written a book would think. Even I used to think like that. कि editor की जरूरत नहीं है, मेरी language correct है. See, that's what I mentioned उससे पहले कि you might be an amazing blogger, you might have an amazing skill in English or comprehension or whatever, but it's not the language. It's the way. Editor's job is not to correct your language. That's a proofreader's job.
Yes.
Right. So proofreading ही कराना है तो आप proofreader को दे दो, वो language speak करके दे देगा, वो opinion नहीं देगा.
Of course.
An editor's job is to make sure that this book works as a book.
Right.
That this book doesn't have excessive descriptions or dialogues or whatever, or if the characters are half-baked. That is a job. See, that's the reason why I said go to an experienced editor.
Right.
Right.
I mean, of course. Right. As you said,
it's not just a grammar.
And writing well, it's a different ball game.
Correct. It's a different ball game. Once you go to such an editor, the editor will get back to you with all these suggestions. It's feedback. Editor does not correct anything. Editor gives you feedback. Red Ink में feedback आता है, वो MS Word पे पूरा वो track करके देता है.
Yes.
Then we as writers, it's my choice whether to accept it or not.
Right.
जो मुझे सही लगता है मैं accept करूँगा, जो मुझे नहीं लगता है वो मैं reject कर दूँगा, and then send it to a publisher. Or if a writer needs a proofreader, then you send it to a proofreader. Editor का काम proofread करना नहीं है. So it's not grammatical polishing that an editor does. An editor does the job that's beyond that.
Exactly.
So it's important, and that's the reason why I said not an English teacher. And that's not a remark on English teachers, because I love my English teachers. But when many of my friends have done that. Even I have done that. I've sent my book to an English teacher, and the English teacher told me this is what I felt. They gave me an analysis of the story. That's not exactly what I needed.
Right.
A teacher will be an expert in teaching. An editor is an expert in editing. Right. A writer will be good at writing.
Good at writing, of course. Everyone has different skill sets, so we need to understand that.
From a teacher, you can get a perspective of a teacher, but from an editor, you get the actual perspective of an editor, which is what is required when you're publishing your book.
Right. All right. So we take one last question. It's from Lakshmi Dare, and it may be weird, but many of horror movies have female protagonists or horrifying characters. So any take on that? Many of horror movie characters?
No, nothing like that. I mean, I don't remember. See, I write horror with female characters because because that's my thing. That's what I write. I connect with uh, a certain gender and I write about it better than other people. But if you look at films, I think there's equal number of male horror protagonists
Or
and female horror protagonists. It's not like that. Maybe uh, maybe India में ऐसा कोई trend है जिसमें कि you only get see it's because see there's a mindset that's at work here.
right.
हमारे सोसाइटी में ये दिखाया जाता है कि आदमी हमेशा चौड़ में रहता है, आदमी हमेशा बोल्ड होता है, करेजियस होता है, लड़की हमेशा लड़की needs the support of a man.
It is about women. That's true.
If there's a mindset like that in the society at large, then what happens is आपकी फिल्मों में जो आपकी कहानियां हैं उसमें फीमेल को हमेशा विक्टिम बना के दिखाया उसको, क्योंकि वो इफेक्ट when you watch that you relate with it.
Yes,
हाँ,
yes.
उसके साथ ये हुआ था इसलिए वो चुड़ैल बन गई. Right. So somewhere I think there's this thought process which is behind that, and maybe that is why most of our Indian films may have these bhoot pret chudails which are female.
Yes.
And that's exactly what I am trying to change in my books. If any of you have read my books, like Dakma, it's not about a vengeful chudail. It's not a vengeful chudail.
Yeah.
Chudail has a reason to be that. I mean, it's not a chudail. Sorry, first of all, it's a very offensive term. The spirit or the ghost of the lady, she had a reason to be a ghost, and she was just asking for help. This is the same theme which I had explored in Brahm, other side of it. And I think more writers should come up with it. Traditionally, जितनी हमारी literature है हिंदी में या regional languages में, it's all about चुड़ैल, डायन, भूतनी. I think that's very derogatory and that's sad, and that should change. And writers like me are trying to change that, and it's a good thing.
Absolutely. All right. So I think this is it. We are on top of time. It's close to 6 p.m. So Hari, thank you very much for sparing time. It was wonderful interacting with you, and I wish you all the best for your future books.
Thank you. Likewise, I also enjoyed a lot, and convey my regards to all your viewers there.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you again. Thank you all those who have joined. Thanks a lot. Bye.